Hi, this is Jen Rubin, and this is The Contrarian. I am absolutely delighted to have my favorite historian and commentator on our current scene, and that is Cox Richardson. Welcome to the show, Heather, and thank you for joining us at The Contrary.
Well, thank you for having me, and so many congratulations on launching The Contrarian. I'm so excited. I was one of your very first subscribers and can't wait to see what becomes of it.
Well, we can't either. So thank you for joining us. We are entering a period of time, and I look back and try to find some historical analogies. I look back and I see Reconstruction, I see the Gilded Age. Tell us a little bit about how we get into these periods and what these periods mean of extreme centralization of wealth and power in the hands of a few.
So, how we get here is a really long story, and it rests, I think, in part in the fact that Americans tend to think that the guardrails of liberal democracy are always going to hold. And of course, they never do, because every time the government, the federal government especially, is used to expand rights and opportunities for people who are not previously included, there's a backlash. And there's a backlash that centers around the idea that the federal government doing things for everybody, trying to keep the playing field level, trying to make sure that some people who have not previously had access to opportunity or not previously been treated equally before the law will be that way going forward. There's a backlash in which people who are trying to garner wealth and power simply say to voters, now, wait a minute here. What that's going to do is it's going to take your tax dollars and distribute them to people of color, to Black Americans, to women who want to work outside the home, people who want a handout, want something for nothing. And we, the good Americans who want to work for what we get, are being cheated. And when that happens, that you have sort of this xenophobic and racist and sexist backlash against the federal government. Again, it can also happen in the state government to achieve a level playing field, and you start to get the concentration of power and wealth. And as that happens, and as the national conversation changes from being one about equality and fairness to one about, hey, they're going to take something from me, both the media and religion and popular culture and politics certainly begin to circle around that idea, and you get extraordinary concentrations of wealth. You see it in the 1850s with the rise of the elite enslavers, who, by the way, were a very small portion of the Southern society as well as national society. White men in the American South after about 1848 are themselves really badly squeezed by the economy. You see it in the 1880s and the 1890s when literally trusts had senators they considered theirs. Senators would introduce themselves as the senator for the sugar trust, for example. And then you see it again in the 1920s. And in all of those periods, you see an extraordinary concentration of wealth based in this public conversation that says this is the way America really should be. And then as that concentrates wealth and people finally see it, you see an extraordinary backlash to that and the reclaiming, at least in the past, of liberal democracy.
We now have a group of Silicon Valley tech billionaires. But this fascination with the self made man, with the individual entrepreneur, has a long history in America, and it's a myth in many respects. Talk to us a little bit about that and how this gang of Silicon Valley bros fits into that tradition and that myth.
Well, the myth starts as soon as the Constitution of the United States of America is ratified. And the if you think about it, in that era, there's a real question, like, what does it mean to live in a democracy? Like, who are the people who support democracy, and what does that even look like? And actually, my Letters from an American is pulled in half from the title of one of the very famous early books in that genre, called Letters from an American Farmer, in which the author asks, what does it mean to be an American? Like, literally, what is an American, this new man? And they start to construct this idea that democracy is centered around a certain type of man and a certain type of woman that works hard in the land. That matters a lot in that early incarnation. and therefore is independent of pressure from an employer, for an example, or from a monarch, or from a religious figure. And that idea of what they called the yeoman farmer is there at the very beginning. But it really takes off after the Civil War in the image of the American cowboy. Because during the Civil War, we tend to forget about the fact that the United States government not only ended enslavement for Americans, except as punishment for crime, which is a big exception. They ended enslavement, the federal government, but they also imposed national taxation for the first time in American history. That's really important. It's the Republicans during the Civil War who imposed the first national taxation, including the income tax, which is a progressive income tax. And what that does is it enables people who don't want the government to expand rights for Black men, which is really what they're focused on in that era, and don't want the government to try and make sure that there are opportunities available for such people who had previously been marginalized in the country. And they start to say, see, we told you that if you had a federal government that was going to do things like end enslavement, that it was only a question of time until it redistributed your hard-earned tax dollars to undeserving Americans. And of course, in the United States in the late 1860s after the war, there's a very distinctive color line that they can hit with that argument. And they do, even though in the policies of the Republicans in Congress at the time benefited poor whites more significantly in many ways even than the Black Americans who had just been emancipated from enslavement. So that argument that, the federal government is socialist, and they literally begin to use that word in 1871, stands in America against their myth of the American cowboy. And the idea of the cowboy is that he's a young man who wants nothing but to work hard and to protect his women and to fight against marginalized populations in the American West, Indigenous Americans and Mexican Americans and robbers, as they called them, and wants to do it without the interference of the federal government. Now, what's fascinating about this is that's a complete misreading of the American cowboy, but it's also a complete misreading of the American West, because we know that in order to survive in the American West, cowboys really were, the equivalent of poor steelworkers on the floors of Carnegie's factories. To survive in the American West, you know what you needed? You needed kinship networks, because it was kinship networks that enabled, for example, fur traders to trade and to sell their furs and to open up new territory. And those kinship networks usually interfaced with the indigenous communities and the Mexican communities. And you needed these communities who would support your trade, but also would, for example, help you rebuild your barn when your barn burned down, which always happened because of the nature of hay of always. So that idea that somehow the West is about this independent young man is just completely belied, not only by the social history, the economic history, but also the political history. If you think about the political history of the American West, that's where we get the alliance movement and the populist movement. But that myth, that idea that a real American is the guy who does it himself in the form, for example, of an American cowboy, gets picked up again in America after President Truman desegregates the U.S. military in 1948, and then really after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which desegregates American public schools, you start to see cowboy stories all over the media. You get, I think it's 8 of the top 10 television shows in 1960 are cowboy TV shows, like Bonanza, like Rawhide, like, all those big TV shows. Bonanza being the first TV show produced across the world in color, a really big deal there. And that idea really bleeds into the popular culture of the era through things like Star Wars, which is really a cowboy movie set in the galaxy. And that's, of course, what Ronald Reagan picks up. So you get this idea that individuals make it on their own, but it's always been a myth. And you look at the tech bros in the present, and, it's funny, I just recently compared Peter Thiel to Thoreau, which, as I always say, will infuriate people. But, when Henry David Thoreau is sitting there at Walden, looking at the men around him living what he calls lives of quiet desperation, he is literally living on somebody else's land. And he goes home for meals. and somebody else does his laundry, and what he's looking at is he's looking at a community of people who are working together to construct a life for their families and their wives and their children and their husbands, and he's looking at it as a young man who has no ties of anything, no responsibilities, and saying, boy, you people are really pathetic. Look at me. I'm the one who knows how to live my life. And that just seems to me to be the tech bros in a nutshell.
Absolutely. And I would just make two observations. One is, as you say, when the federal government acts, the biggest beneficiaries are working class, middle class whites. So the very people who then elect a Donald Trump are really working against their self-interest. And the other obvious irony here is that the Peter Thiels, the Elon Musks are themselves immigrants. They are part of the immigrant story, and yet they perpetuate this white nationalism. As we approach noon today and the incoming president, I have to ask you, have we ever seen anything like this before?
Well, yes. And this honestly is what haunts me. Um, we talk about American democracy, and I tend to talk about it as a long enduring concept that we've had really for almost 250 years. But of course, you and I both know that American democracy was viable at the start because it included so few people. And when I look at the present, it reminds me overwhelmingly of Reconstruction, when in fact, what happens in the American South is we lose democracy. We lose the ability to achieve the democracy that seemed reachable during the Civil War after the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. And what we see across the American South is a one-party state, because the states of the former Confederacy go solid for the Democratic Party in 76. People don't recognize it then, they recognize it by 1880. And you don't see a break in that solid South until 1920, when Tennessee votes for Harding. But then it really stays the solid South until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. And that one-party state is so important for thinking about this present, because what happens is they have elections, but the Democrats are going to win the elections. And more than that, it's not just that Black Americans have no rights that they can claim in that region at that time, but white Americans don't either. I mean, women have the threat of violence against them and have very few rights in those places, but neither do white men, because even if you're a white man in one of those states, it depends who you know and who is, what gang that you are related to is in power. So the rule of law comes down to these fiefdoms of groups of people who may or may not honor your rights under the state laws and under the constitutional laws, which are already skewed in the favor of certain people. And what happens when that happens is that you get extraordinary corruption, of course, because what are you going to do? You're going to pay off the people in power to keep you safe, and capital flees the region. I mean, there is a reason that we don't see economic growth in the American South until FDR comes in and begins to use the federal government in those regions under demands for certain fair practices, and why FDR is so welcomed, not only by Black Americans who finally have some opportunities, but also from the white Americans who can say, finally, there's an outside arbiter for what's happening around me that will enable me to advance without having to make friends or to suck up to whomever is in power. And it seemed to me for a long time that what the radical right in America was trying to do was essentially to spread that Reconstruction government across the American nation, which we have had before, but which in this very global era means that we will be acting much more like places like Vladimir Putin's Russia or Viktor Orban's Hungary than we ever will be like our past in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, when it really looked as if we were going to make liberal democracy real.
It is absolutely chilling, Heather, because what you have sketched out is such a compelling analogy. And that period of time lasted for so long. So, as we reach the end of our time, I have to ask, what's the path out? how in the past have we gotten ourselves out of this? And what's the way forward for American small d democracy and for lovers of democracy?
It is important to remember that during those periods, people did not shut up. And they continued to work for the realization of equality before the law and a right to have a say in your government. And one of the great institutions, of course, is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which formally organizes on Lincoln's birthday in 1909. And what the NAACP did is it began to fight legal cases to try and enforce the equality before the law. But the NAACP recognized pretty early, thanks to W.E.B. Du Bois, that people really do want to do the right thing, but they live in disinformation. And so the way to make sure that people in general recognize the needs of a democracy was constantly to publicize them. And I think it is no accident that W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a genius, of course, and he could have done anything in the NAACP, chose to run their publications, chose to run the crisis. And it's really that highlighting of the information that the NAACP put in front of people, including people like Rosa Parks, who everybody knows for not sitting down on the bus or not moving to the back of the bus, but who was in fact somebody who went, family to discover cases of sexual abuse against Black women, and it had kept those statistics for the NAACP. It's that constant focus on reality, on making sure people understand what the reality is. So we hit constantly at the myths and say that's not really what's happening. A few people are staying in power to garner all the wealth and all the power over the rest of us. And here's the reality of what's happening. And people understanding that and keeping alive the spirit of democracy, the creativity of democracy, and I would add the joy of democracy, is what finally forced people to recognize that marginalized Americans must have rights. And it's important to remember, I think, that the people who voted for the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were all white men. And they voted to expand those rights because they felt such extraordinary public pressure to do what was right and to try to protect American democracy, because that was what was right for them, as well as for the people who were suffering so terribly under the regimes that were existing then in the American South. So what I would say is, we need to continue to be creative. One of the things about the late 19th century is the extraordinary art that comes out of it, music that comes out of it, new kinds of clothing, new kinds of technology, there are all kinds of entrepreneurs. But we also have to continue to fight against disinformation and to make sure people understand what is happening. And that, of course, brings us right back to where we started, why the contrarian is so incredibly important and why so many independent creators in this moment are so important. It's there in the crisis that people began to hear about what was happening in the American South, but it's also in places like McClure's magazine that they began to see why that was so important for them in northern cities, as well as people in the American South. So I think we're trying to do the right thing here.
Well, there is no one who is more important in chronicling our time than Letters from an American and Heather. And I just want to underscore one thing you said. It's about culture as well. We cannot simply feed Americans a steady diet of only politics and law. And that's one of the things that we're going to try to do, talk about sports and music and art and film and humor, because as you say, part of the weapon against authoritarianism is joy. So thank you, Heather, for joining us. I hope to have you back many times in the future. And please, all of you, if there's someone living under a rock and has not heard of Letters to an American, I find that amazing. Please go and find Heather's work. Thank you, and continued good luck in everything you do.
Thanks for having me. I'd love to come back.